Welcome everyone to Track C. My name is Wayne Eckerson, your track chair, and it is my pleasure to introduce your next speaker. I've known Doug Laney for many years as a fellow analyst and consultant. Officially, Doug is the Data and Analytics Strategy Innovation Fellow at West Monroe, where he consults the business, data, and analytics leaders on developing new value streams from their data assets. Doug originated the field of Infonomics and authored the best-selling book, Infonomics, How to Monetize, Manage, and Measure Information as an Asset for Competitive Advantage. You'll learn more about this in this session today. Doug is also a three-time Gartner Annual Thought Leadership Award recipient. He co-chairs this event and is also a visiting professor at the University of Illinois, Guy's College of Business, and Carnegie Mellon University's Heinz College. So Doug, it's all yours.
Thanks, Wayne. I think it's an annual award, not an anal award, but that's all right. I probably deserve both at Gartner. Let's share here. There we go. How are we looking?
Looks good to me.
All right, great. All right, thanks everyone for being here. Good morning from Chicago. Doug Laney. We're going to talk about the concept of Infonomics. I've been talking about it for a number of years, published a book on the topic. And one of the things I want to get into is a little bit of some of the more advanced topics that I and some of my students have been exploring. So a few years ago, well, first, let me just introduce West Monroe. So West Monroe is a consultancy based in Chicago, a U.S. consultancy that focuses on business and technology consulting. One of the interesting things that we do is we help advise private equity clients and their portfolio companies on what's called technology diligence. We help them understand the value of their technology assets and also their data assets by applying some of the Infonomics principles. So that's a bit about us. Many of you are probably familiar with the Infonomics book. Some nice things that people have said who are not my relatives. And so a few years ago, The Economist proclaimed data the new oil, and hundreds of other consultants and thought followers and others had jumped on and parroted this meme. Certainly this underscores data's increasing value in organizations, but I think it entirely misses the point that data has unique characteristics that make it potentially much more valuable than oil. No, my name is not Inigo Montoya, and you did not kill my father, but by repeating this tired and I think inaccurate meme that data is the new oil, what we're doing is we're killing broader and deeper opportunities to generate revenue streams from it, and I'll explain. First, let's acknowledge the similarities between data and oil, which admittedly there are several. Yes, at a macro level, just as oil was a driver of economic growth at the turn of the last century, data today is a driver in this century. However, it seems that these similar characteristics, so these similarity characteristics, are the ones that continue to distract data professionals and business leaders from realizing data's full benefits. Yes, of course, data can be, so of course data can be acquired or harvested or licensed or traded from a variety of data sources. There are a trillion websites from which data can be harvested, billions of social media posts featuring trends and leading indicators. There are tens of millions of open data sets published by government organizations and others, thousands of data brokers and aggregators, and an emerging crop of online data marketplaces as well. Some of them you'll hear about this week. As well, most businesses have dozens of business partners with whom they can exchange data. Yes, of course, data usually must be refined in various ways to become more usable and consumable by business processes. This, of course, involves integrating, cleansing, enriching it in various ways for particular purposes. And data, just like any other asset is stored, of course, we store it in some way. And then typically we will pipe it to those who are using it or consuming it. And then just like any other kind of asset, data can be purchased. However, more often data is licensed, in which its usage rights, not the actual ownership of data, are conveyed upon the buyer or the licensee. And then data, like oil, is used in fueling business processes. We talk about companies becoming data-driven. And also data, like oil, can be processed and transformed into different kinds of products, like we see here, plastic bottles. And yes, they can both be spilled, arguably. However, unlike oil, when data is spilled, it cannot be cleaned up at all. So that's kind of where the similarities end. And so let's explore some of the key differences that make data much more valuable than oil. First, let's take a look at what happens when we use a drop of oil versus a unit of, say, data, say a transaction or a customer record. When you consume oil, it depletes, and you can't use that data over and over again. Data or information, on the other hand, can be used over and over again without ever diminishing. Data is what the economists would call a non-rivalrous, would call it a non-depleting asset. That is, data's relevancy may diminish over time, but not if you continue to find more and more business processes, so that you're not only using data for a single purpose, and if you're not, then you're not really realizing its full potential. So this is what we call a non-depleting characteristic of data. Which gets us to the second major difference. When a drop of oil is being used, how many other ways can it be used simultaneously? That's right, none. Data, on the other hand, is an asset that can be used in multiple ways by multiple people or processes at the same time. It's what we call a non-rivalrous asset. Let's take a look at that. This is what makes data potentially and exponentially more valuable than oil, is that we can use the same data multiple ways for different purposes. There's one other kind of key difference here between oil and data, is that what they produce when we use them. When we use data, say for customer insights to generate more sales, these sales create more transactions that in turn create more data. It's a flywheel kind of scenario. This doesn't happen with oil. Using oil doesn't create more oil. It doesn't create more resources of any kind. It simply creates, heat, energy, pollutants, and so forth. So data is what we call a propagating or regenerative asset that is making it that much more valuable than oil for organizations that appreciate and take advantage of this kind of property. Okay, so those are three major differences in oil, and organizations that are taking advantage of this are the ones that are really thriving in the industry. So let's just do a quick background on Infonomics. I've been presenting this for a number of years. And so the way that it all fits together is that if we're thinking about data as an actual asset, and it's pretty easy to make the case that data is an asset because it meets the accounting criteria of an asset. It's something that is owned and controlled, exchangeable for cash, and generates what accountants call probable future economic benefits. So when we start to think about assets, what do we do with assets? Well, first thing we do is we manage them, we collect them, we store them, and we manage them in some way to improve their value. I'll be doing a session in a bit highlighting some of Larry English's ideas on information quality. But there's other things that we do to manage data, of course, and then we can monetize it as well. If we're managing data well, then we're in a better position to monetize it. And the way this kind of all fits together is that there's the old adage that you can't manage what you don't measure. And so I think that because many organizations don't measure the value of their data, they don't understand its quality characteristics, they don't understand its contribution to business value, its potential value, if it were to be deployed in multiple ways. Or even its value as if it were a balance sheet asset. I think because organizations don't measure it that way, they're in a poor position to manage it like an asset. You don't get the budget, the resources, the support that you need to manage it like an asset. And I think it follows that any asset that you're not managing as an asset is one that you're not going to be able to monetize effectively or generate economic benefits from. You see that the definition here of monetizing data is not necessarily about selling data, but about generating measurable economic benefits from it. So for most organizations, this cycle is kind of a downward spiral of not measuring, therefore not managing, and therefore not monetizing data as well as they can. And the basic idea behind Infonomics, like the key takeaway is, let's reverse this curse. And that is, or flip the script to get organizations to start thinking about data as an asset. And if they are, then to measure it. And by measuring it, you're in a better position to manage it as an actual asset, perhaps by even applying well-honed asset management principles and practices. And then you're in a better position to monetize it, in a variety of ways. And so that's kind of the core of Infonomics that I've spoken about and written about over the years. But what I want to cover in this session is more about some advanced Infonomics topics, and that is the application of economic models to data. Although it may be characterized as the dismal science, the field of economics offers another lens to us as data professionals and business leaders for understanding and applying information assets and for optimizing information-related investments. Business information and technology leaders really have to develop and optimize business models and applications and information products and digital solutions with economics of information in mind. Unfortunately, the classic macro and microeconomic principles were developed to better understand and improve the consumption of traditional goods and services, over the last, mostly over the last couple hundred years. We often talk in the economics classes about, guns and butter, if you recall your econ 101 class. But to date, they've never really been applied in any formal way to information assets. And I like to think that that I and my students in my University of Illinois MBA class are among the first people to really dive into how do we apply economic models to data. So in this class that I teach, I explore a few economic models of particular interest, and I'll share what those are. The class that I teach started a few years ago following the publication of the Infonomics book. The University of Illinois Geese Business School asked me to start teaching. And in the first class, I had 12 students. It was very interactive and intimate. The next year, we had 60 students. And this year's cohort, which just wrapped up, started out with about 400 students. I think we ended up with about 300. I scared a bunch away. But it's really a testament to the interest in those future business leaders and accountants in truly understanding not only the accounting of data, but how to manage data as an asset and how to apply economic concepts to it. From day one, I reminded them in this class that Infonomics is a nascent field, and that I won't be spoon feeding them, but rather challenging them to advance the ideas together. And that's really what we've done. For one of the assignments, I asked them to select any economic concept not mentioned in the Infonomics book, and then explore how does that apply to data? Does the concept or the model hold? Does it break down entirely, or how would you adapt it or modify it for data instead of for goods and services for which the concept was originally conceived? The essays that they wrote, were about 300 words. They were not academically rigorous, but an amazing start. And I truly was blown away by some of the ideas, and I congratulate the students and find that it's certainly worth sharing some of these ideas in their papers with you all. And I hope you do enjoy them, and it gives you some thought on the topic, some ideas of your own. Rather than just being kind of all academic about it, I'm going to try to also characterize some of these ideas prescriptively. That is, how might you and your organization put these ideas to work? And again, I hope you find them interesting and insightful or inspirational. So first, let's examine how some classic microeconomic concepts apply to information assets. To start with, I'll share some of the handful that my colleagues and I noodled. Not the students' ones, but I'll share those in a moment. So let's start with supply and demand. Supply and demand, from the most fundamental, is the most fundamental form of concepts in economics. Whether you're an academic, a farmer, a pharmaceutical manufacturer, or simply a consumer, the basic premise of supply and demand equilibrium is integrated into your daily actions, even if you're a CDO, a data architect, or a data and analytics consumer. The law of supply and demand is actually an economic theory that was popularized by Adam Smith in 1776. The principles of supply and demand have been shown to be very effective in predicting market behavior. However, of course, there are other market factors, multiple factors that affect markets on both a microeconomic and macroeconomic level. And we'll of course look at some of these over the next hour. Yeah. So the basic idea is, as the price of a good increases, the demand for a product will, except for a few obscure situations, decrease. And similarly, as the price of a good decreases, the demand will increase. And then conversely, as demand increases, suppliers will regulate supply and maximize profits by increasing the price. And similarly, as demand decreases for whatever reason, suppliers will usually decrease the price to maximize or maintain revenue. So these forces are what's called an equilibrium. But information is really an unruly asset. As I pointed out earlier, it doesn't deplete when consumed. It can be used simultaneously. It's representative of some other entity or activity, typically, or idea. It costs comparatively little to store or transmit. It can be instantly transform or disappear. And at once its supply can seem both infinite and its demand insatiable. Yet most organizations strive to generate or collect more information, even as their ability to consume it struggles to keep up. Regardless, demand for data throughout your organization typically goes largely unfulfilled. At least that's what we hear from clients, that there's more demand for data than data being made available. I think this is an indication of an information supply chain inefficiency. And we'll talk a bit about market failures in a bit. This might be an internal market failure, not so much as an information ecosystem imbalance. But wait, if the same unit of information can be sold or licensed and delivered or transmitted to multiple buyers, remember the non-rivalry principle, that data can be copied and sold same data can be sold and used ad nauseum simultaneously. Isn't the supply of available information infinite? So how can its price achieve some kind of market equilibrium? Well, we've theorized that it really can't. So, and I'll explain in a moment. So, and accordingly, if the supply is infinite, how hasn't the price of information dropped to zero? So clearly, the classic supply and demand breaks down for different kinds, for information assets. And I think that executives and business leaders and architects really need to understand how this price equilibrium operates differently with information than with traditional goods and services. It's not based on balancing supply or demand, but rather on a more probably sophisticated function of information costs, viable uses, market saturation, risk, and increasingly on the availability of alternative data sources. So consumers of information shouldn't expect to buy it merely at some nominal cost premium. And suppliers of information have to consider how attenuating market saturation will affect the number of buyers at any given price point, and vice versa. This is in turn affects its revenue stream. So achieving an information price equilibrium, it would seem, involves a bit of game theory, probably well beyond the classic supply and demand and scope of this book. Let's talk a little bit more about pricing. This brings us naturally to consider how to price information. Increasingly, much information is purchased by organizations, not just produced by it, either directly gathered from data brokers, purchased by data brokers, or harvested from social media aggregators, or indirectly in the form of trading goods or services. And what this does is it puts a microscope on the issue of information pricing. For those of you familiar with the market value of information, or the MVI model that I published in Infonomics, and the topic of supply and demand, but pricing information can be more convoluted than pricing traditional goods and services. Yes, there are a few what economists call, or accountants call, open arm's length marketplaces, which establish viable market valuations for some kinds of information, Or as I once researched for a client, there's actually black market for data on the dark web, and we use that to help them value their data to determine what to spend on securing it. Interesting story. I worked with while I was at Gartner, one of my colleagues there, who was our information security expert, asked me, I asked him, what do organizations spend on information security if they don't know the value of what they're securing? And he said, well, it's a good question. They probably use one of two methods. They either keep up with the Joneses, and spend what others have spent on information security. They use benchmark data for that, or they wait for some kind of catastrophic event and then spend enough to make sure that or something like it doesn't happen again. I refer to that latter form of valuation as blunder funding. So anyway, I think perhaps it's as important or more important than fixing a price for a unit of information is to understand how its price changes in response to other factors. That is, its elasticity, primarily the change in information supply and demand. The price elasticity, easy for me to say, the price elasticity of information supply measures how much a supplier, like a publisher or producer of data, chooses to supply in response to a change in price. But since, remember, information is inherently replicable, why would a supplier like a data broker or a book publisher limit the supply even with downward price pressure? It's simple: to prevent the price from approaching zero, resulting in negligible or even negative profits. In most cases, it makes more sense for the data supplier to increase the supply up to the point at which the market saturation creates significant downward price pressure. And this is really the theory and the mechanics behind the market value of information valuation model in Infonomics. You'll think about it. So I came from Gartner, and think about any publisher. They establish a price point for that publication. It's not based on the price of that information. It's based on some optimal price curve of supply and demand and generating sufficient revenue on optimizing revenue, not on optimizing sales. So anyway, on the other hand, the demand elasticity of information suggests that at some price point, an information consumer will seek an alternative or kind of some substitute source of data. When fewer alternative sources, let's say like retail pricing data or even IT research from Gartner and Forrester and others are available, then the information asset is critical, and switching costs are prohibitive. What happens then is that the price premiums can be maintained and vice versa. Therefore, enterprise efforts to identify and curate information sources can be really important, not just for improving information's utility, but also for negotiating the price of current licensed or bartered information. If you find alternative sources of anything, you're in a better position to negotiate price. The same with data. Moreover, the growing variety and availability of data sources, especially those open data published by government organizations and others, compels data suppliers to differentiate, either with expanded information sets, improved data quality, improved timeliness, integration of additional sources, the addition of data derivative products like analytics, or even services to help integrate that data into your own systems. So, all right. Let's move on to marginal utilities. So the supply, demand, and pricing of information are in part determined by, of course, its utility. Economists define utility as a general measure of happiness or pleasure from some asset, or probably non-financial benefits. This is not to be confused with value, in which benefits and costs are actually juxtaposed. Marginal utility is the additional, I would say marginal utility is the additional satisfaction gained from consuming one additional unit of a good or service. Now, economists and marketers use this kind of concept to determine how much or how much more of an item a consumer will buy or consume. And in most situations, each subsequent unit of something consumed has less utility than the prior one. This is the law of diminishing marginal utility. Think about it. If you're eating like an ice cream cone, the first one's good, the second one's maybe good, the third one maybe not so much. Eventually, you might achieve negative marginal utility, which often happens with like beer drinking at fraternities. So anyway, positive marginal utility occurs when the consumption of an additional unit of good or service increases the consumer's total utility. For example, when a child receives, say, an additional outfit for their doll. Conversely, negative marginal utility is when the consumption of an additional unit decreases the total utility, again, such as that when that extra scoop of ice cream makes you feel unwell. Now, publishing or directly exposing people to repeated identical information leads to rapidly diminishing marginal utility and very little increase in total utility for each unit of information published. Think about it, reading the same book or the same article over and over again, maybe some marginal utility, but it drops off pretty quick. However, marginal utility can increase for the first few units of information, and negative marginal utility can be experienced, as I mentioned, much more quickly than when consuming tangible products or services. So creators of information, again, such as journals, publishers, and advertisers, and data brokers are going to find a high level of initial marginal utility among their consumers for original content or new units of information, but not nearly as much for messages that are repeated beyond perhaps the first few. However, since information isn't depleted when it's consumed and is non-rivalrous, as we said, it can be used multiple ways simultaneously, this high level of initial marginal utility can be capitalized on simultaneously across multiple consumers. So rather than thinking about one consumer, let's think about multiple consumers and the aggregate marginal utility. This is, again, a key principle of data monetization. Data architects, I think, really should be seeking to design systems that increase information availability for multiple human and/or machine consumers. So let's talk about machines. Publishing the same information to the same individual repeatedly results in, as we mentioned, fast diminishing marginal utility for humans, quickly leading to negative marginal utility and diminishing total utility. As a result, information producers and publishers tend to strive to achieve a balance between pushing information to individuals in a frequency and periodicity that matches their preferred consumption characteristics for those individuals. Like how often do we want news or new news or repeated news or derivative news? So understanding information consumption patterns across increasingly granular segments of individuals can help optimize the total utility of the information published. Again, for example, publishing an enterprise performance dashboard of, say, strategic indicators to executives on a daily basis can result in rapidly diminishing marginal information utility and ultimately the disuse of these dashboards. Whereas publishing daily changes or a monthly dashboard may retain higher levels of marginal information utility. However, humans aren't the only consumers of data. For technologies such as systems, applications, devices that increasingly are becoming the primary consumers of data, the marginal utility principle has to be adjusted or rethought to accommodate the following couple of scenarios. First, repeated identical units of information received by a component of technology, say a piece of software, offers zero marginal utility and a constant total utility. And second, if we consider the total cost to process or ignore repeated units of identical information, then perhaps total utility could be perceived to decline with each successive piece of identical information received. Therefore, we think that data and solution architects should be working to filter out redundant information instead of only collect or stream changes. They should filter out redundant information and instead focus on collecting or streaming changes or deltas to the data. And in remote IoT environments where bandwidth and edge processing is limited, this becomes a really important consideration for the transmission of remote sensors, current status rather than only a state change. For example, thermostats. Okay, they're designed to take periodic readings and only activate the HVAC units upon some kind of temperature delta of a prescribed magnitude, such as like 2 degrees or more change, then it activates. If instead thermostats were designed to activate and deactivate HVAC units based on continuous and often identical temperature readings, these devices would soon suffer damage, or much more sooner than they would otherwise. So there are 3 basic solutions that we've come up with to architecting systems that can avoid the undesirable conditions caused by streams of identical information. First is to transmit data, distinct data, if and when it's produced and filtered by the publisher or the publishing system. IoT devices, for example, might only send updates when their state changes. The second is to transmit only differential data, which includes the delta between subsequent data points. Examples include the aptly named differential backups, right? You have differential backups for your data. And also accelerometer sensors and water leak detectors are classic examples of this. And then the third idea is to produce and transmit only derivative data. Examples include publishing a revision to a previously published book or article rather than republishing the entire book, or applying different algorithms to a piece of information in order to craft uniquely differentiated messages for particular customers. You can see this is kind of a complex topic, but at its core, the kind of the recommendations are pretty straightforward. All right, let's move on to opportunity costs. Now, while marginal utility deals with the diminishing benefits of consuming additional units of the same thing, opportunity costs refers to the foregone benefits from choosing or choosing to consume one thing rather than another. In the sphere of Infonomics, this means selecting one data source over another, or performing minimal analysis in the interest of expense or minimizing expense or improving expediency. I think it's the job of the chief data officer to ensure that opportunity costs for information and analytics are understood and employed to drive related strategies. As new data sources and analytic capabilities are continually presenting themselves, data and analytics opportunity costs, data and analytic opportunity cost assessments have to be a periodic activity. Also, CDOs, business leaders, and enterprise architects, I believe, have to be aware of potential or unintended consequences or externalities. We'll talk about that in a moment when planning to shift to new sources. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Oh, wait, did I do that right here? Yeah, let's talk about the endowment effect here. So, as I mentioned, people need to be aware of the potential unintended consequences or externalities, as economists call it, when planning to shift to new sources of data or new types of analytics. In addition, externalities are a major consideration for any organization publishing data, either publicly or privately. Information can be used for an endless array of uses. So I think CDOs especially must anticipate and prepare for how others might use, or more importantly, misuse data that the organization shares. Okay. Yeah, okay. So let's talk about the endowment effect. One of the things I find is that enterprise inertia often keeps organizations publishing pretty pie charts when deeper insights from advanced analytics like machine learning are readily available. Unfortunately, most organizations are unaware of the variety of alternate data sources available, and so they continue to use less accurate, complete, or timely data sources because, well, that's the way we've always done it. The economic principle behind this is called the endowment effect, in which people ascribe a greater value to something merely because they possess it. The endowment effect, I think, quietly motivates business people to resist data and analytic progress. So it's really up to business and data leaders to help people get over the attitude of, you'll pry these reports from my cold dead hands. Certain strategies might include, introducing incentives, intramural contests or competitions to better use data, self-service analytics initiatives, data literacy programs, examples from competitors or other organizations to kind of stir the creative juices or shame people into doing more with their data. Or in some cases, it can include outright just turning off existing reports that are barely used. And in many cases, you'll find that actually nobody complains about that. The next one I'll cover here is production frontiers. Sometimes the inhibitor to improving the production or quality of information or to implement more advanced analytics capabilities is due to internal information production possibility frontiers. That is, the organization would have to shift available budgets and resources from one activity, say developing an ERP application, to support data-related improvements. This, of course, assumes that the organization is operating at near optimal productive efficiency. So production possibility frontiers are a common reason for things like stagnant data governance efforts. People are busy. They don't have time to deal with developing or adhering to additional data principles and policies without sacrificing other tasks that they're responsible for, i.e. producing other things. However, I think there are several ways to overcome these information-related production possibility frontier challenges. One is to embed information-related activities into other activities to kind of soften their impact on resources. Another might be to automate data-related activities or other activities to free up resources to push out that curve. Another might be to use ROI modeling to justify additional resources, thereby expanding the production possibility frontier outward. Or, as my former colleague at Gartner, Michael Smith, and I posited, one of the things you can do is you can apply the future alternate economic benefits of a data asset to fund additional resources today. In fact, at West Monroe, we've partnered with an information bank to fund, with an investment bank to fund data monetization efforts at our clients who want the rewards without taking any of the risk or having to make those kind of production frontier trade-offs. Remember, data is, again, a non-rivalrous asset, meaning the same information can be used for multiple purposes. So, plan for new ways to use information and funnel the expected revenue or savings into additional information-related resources. Now, ultimately, each of these economic factors influence or should influence how and when you make information-related investments. Investments come in a variety of forms related to developing a vision and strategy, devising and incorporating data-specific metrics, data governance, skills and processes, and of course, the technology and architecture. But how is an organization, or more specifically a chief data officer, supposed to gauge the appropriate level of investment? When do or should investments in information asset management pay off? What happens to maturity when an information asset, along with related procedures and technologies, are merely maintained but not really improved? Conversely, what if you accelerate data-related investments, and how mature should you be or need to be, especially related to your competitors? Listen, there's no outright formula for this, but we did develop a model for understanding the variety of forces and positioning that your organization is on this curve. The information yield curve is a concept that we built loosely inspired by the traditional financial yield curve. And what it does is it expresses the rate of improved value per unit of information-related investment. The curve brings together conceptually the concepts of data monetization, data management, and data measurement. We all know information asset management, or IAM, involves numerous moving parts. So, and there are many factors that exert upward or downward pressure on information maturity, but what does this curve look like, and where are you on it? So in short, and there's a few other versions of this curve that I have to, but I won't share them here. But I'll kind of talk through them. The curve generally shows how low maturity organizations will see accelerating improvements in the rate of return for their data assets from data-related investments, while high maturity organizations are going to kind of see decelerating rates as they approach kind of an optimization ceiling. Similarly, low maturity organizations that accelerate their data investments are going to experience a maturity bump that kind of begins to level off. For example, moving to a more sophisticated analytics platform will have quicker returns initially, until kind of your competitors, may catch up. Or market dynamics change, or the platform becomes overwhelmed by the increased amount of data, such as we've observed over recent years. The forces exerting upward pressure to improve and accelerate maturity absolutely should be embraced and cultivated. And many of these kinds of forces include data quality, accessibility of data, improved compliance, analytics, governance, and so forth. And the downward forces that limit and tend to decelerate maturity efforts, include the increasing volume of data, the velocity, the variety of data, the 3 V's as I call them, and the increasing ubiquity of data assets, the speed of business, regulatory mandates, and so forth. Maybe things like the lack of data trust or the lack of metadata. So your organization is going to find itself or choose to be on kind of a different relative position and path along this curve. Listen, there's no right or wrong place on the curve. It's just kind of important to know where you are and where you're headed and what to expect from information-related investments. You'll find maybe you're an industry average, kind of in the middle of the curve, where you're tracking along with the industry pack, making similar investments, dealing with downward pressures on par with others, and therefore kind of receiving an average return on your data assets. Or maybe you're a high performer, above the curve, or above on the curve. You didn't get a jump on others in your industry, but investments are paying off better, and you're doing a better job of mitigating downward pressures. Therefore, your information yield is greater than others. Or maybe you're a low performer, below on the curve. You're not effectively deploying data solutions that you've invested in, or you're succumbing to downward pressures more so than other organizations. Or maybe you're a leader ahead on the curve. You've got a head start on your competition and have continued to reap the rewards of greater information. Or maybe you're a laggard, where you're off to a slow start in making investments and therefore really not generating much value from it as well. Of course, these positions on the curve are subjective, but they kind of give you a sense of where you are and where you want to be along the curve. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to say about that one. All right, let's move on to some of the ones from the students. And you see at the top, I've highlighted the students who are behind these ideas. Really excited by some of the work that they've done, and I'm trying to figure out how to put them into a compendium with the approval of the university. So these students found that cost. First, let's talk about cost-benefit analysis. It's obviously it's a process that businesses use to analyze which decisions to make and which to forego. The cost-benefit analysis sums the potential rewards for expected from a situation or action, and then subtracts out the total costs associated with taking that action. So the question is, can CBA be used to determine whether a business should invest in information or information solutions? These students found that most of the CBA process does carry over whether you're evaluating a physical asset or a data asset, but there's some unique ways that it really doesn't apply. Unlike analyzing the cost and benefits of physical assets, data doesn't really get used up when it's consumed, remember? And the machine consumption of information is increasingly common, which has low marginal costs and high potential benefits. There's also a special case of information that may require special handling in the CBA, and they felt that it requires a more sophisticated analysis to determine things like the perishability of data. They also felt that there are few market systems that provide data valuation, other than what we've published in Infonomics, and this really requires probably a new form of certification for conducting CBA analyses that use information. In fact, I just wrapped up a project with a major pharmaceutical company in which we adapted the Infonomics valuation models to do a cost-benefit analysis on various data assets that they were generating or acquiring. And as part of this analysis, we looked not only at the cost of data, but also the cost of managing, storing, securing, and integrating the data. And on the benefits side, we not only looked at the current use cases and the value they're generating, but also at the future potential use cases and their probability of being implemented over a particular time horizon. This gave us an estimated net present value of each data set, and thereby helped the company determine whether the data set should continue to be curated or not. Other students here looked at human capital theory and how it applies. Human capital theory involves how to properly pay a person based on their work. how that person's worth changes through investments and formal education and so forth. They felt that investment in human capital can produce more valuable and monetizable information, and therefore maybe people should get paid based on the value of the data that they're, in part at least, based on the value of the data they're purchasing. If there were a valuation model for information, companies would be more motivated to invest in human capital that produces it. I think it's kind of a brilliantly simple idea that valuating data could incentivize some companies to invest more in human capital as a means of data production. Other students here looked at scarcity, a great concept to consider. There's kind of some confusion as to whether data is a finite resource in which its production is outstripped by consumption. One could argue that information doesn't qualify as finite. At least subjectively, it seems that the volume of information is growing faster than its uses. Maybe there are metrics for this. On the other hand, if you consider duplicate data as a separate consumable resource, or one that's not depletable or non-rivalrous, then you could consider data reasonably infinite. So for business leaders, business and data leaders, the implication is that if a certain type of data exists, it's theoretically abundant because identical copies are easy and cheap to make, but there may be several advantages to artificially, as we talked about, maintaining scarcity, price, and competition. So in general, organizations should strive to maintain an external scarcity of data they produce, but an internal abundance. Think about that. Let's talk about collateral and leverage. This is more of a finance concept than an economic one. This group from early 2020 determined that a company's data could be used to collateralize loans. However, doing so would require a valuation method that was accepted, again, by both parties, and very likely the agreement would have to regulate how any privacy or use restrictions weren't violated by the lender in case of a default. This team also made the argument that data may be a preferred form of collateral since it doesn't deplete, although it does depreciate. Depletion and depreciation are related, but entirely different concepts about how an asset devalues. This team also did some research to find that some organizations have actually collateralized their trademarks, which is interesting, another form of intangible asset. And of course, we all know what happened a couple of months later. United and American Airlines, among others, secured loans for which they collateralized their customer loyalty programs to the tune of a valuation that was a multiple of the company's own market value at the time. American Airlines customer loyalty data was deemed to be worth about $19 to $30 billion, whereas its own market value was only about $8 billion at the time. So, lesson is the value of your data may be more than the value of your company itself, especially if you can collateralize it. Diminishing returns, we'll share a few more here and then kind of get to wrapping up. I'm not sure I'll have time to share them all, but we'll of course share the slides. Another team explored the concept of data's regenerative or progenitive nature in that using data creates more data. For example, a supply reordering system uses sales forecast data along with inventory level data and often price fluctuation and other economic data to determine what items to purchase. And when those items are purchased, all sorts of valuable transaction, supplier, financial, and other supply chain data are produced as a result. So their theory is that the aggregate and derivative marginal returns on using data may be ever increasing, a flywheel effect, as our soon-to-be latest billionaire astronaut Jeff Bezos calls it. But I think this kind of bears some further analysis. In any case, the lesson here is for organizations to be sure that you're capturing the derivative and subsequent value of data generated every time you use it. This company looked at it's a bit tricky. This group looked at a topic that's a bit tricky because we're thinking of information in a couple of different ways here. Basically, the concept of asymmetric information is known as information failure, occurs when one party to a transaction possesses greater knowledge than another party. This typically manifests when a seller of a good or service possesses more knowledge than the other one. So in the case of data-related transactions like selling or licensing data, often the seller will have more information about the information or metadata than the buyer will. So in short, this team was making the case that buyers or licensees of data should strive to learn as much as they can about the data, its accuracy, consistency, completeness, availability, update frequency, timeliness, integrity, precision, and so forth. You also want to determine its scarcity or ubiquity. That is, do your competitors also have access to it? Some thoughts on that. Another group looked at incentives. We spoke earlier about incentives. This team expanded on the idea to suggest that how incentivizing the use of data could be cost effective to an organization. That is the value generated by the data itself could be more than the cost of the incentive program itself. So far we've looked at various microeconomic concepts. Now let's explore some ideas that are more kind of global in nature. One here is called comparative advantage. These students argue that unlike natural resources or geographic location, no country has a natural competitive advantage when it comes to producing or consuming data. However, countries and companies with better technology and educated workers will have an advantage in both producing and consuming technology, a self-perpetuating advantage at that, and one that really heretofore really hasn't been well measured, at least economically. So I have to say overall that my students were very concerned about the issues of equal access and personal privacy. And this group explored how the traditional concept of economic inequality relates to and translates to into access to data. They observed that traditional measures of inequality don't take into consideration access to information, but rather are fixated on the distribution of income and wealth. They contend that unequal access to information results in further economic inequality, not only due to a direct lack of knowledge by those individuals, but that the producers of information tend to cater to those with access, thereby perpetuating the downward spiral or gap for those with lesser access. So as an organization, with say a diversity and inclusion initiative, as many do, you might also consider not simply who you're hiring, but also the underserved individuals and groups externally who might benefit from the data that your company produces or collects. This group looked at the topic of gains from trade, which are the net benefits to economic agents from being allowed to increase an increase in voluntary trading with one another. This group argued that this concept holds for data assets as well as for traditional resources. Productivity frontiers can be expanded by enabling the unfettered trade of data. However, they noted that unless data is made scarce enough, often artificially so, as we talked about, that these gains may be limited or even negligible. So this is further argument that business and data leaders really need to be circumspect and disciplined about what data they're sharing with whom and what they expect to receive in return. Another group looked at market failure, which is the economic situation defined by an inefficient distribution of goods and services in a free market. This group of students contended that data monopolies shouldn't really, in theory, exist due to the ease with which data can be generated, shared, and reused, but that certain monopolies or oligopolies do exist, as evidenced by certain social media companies. Still, even with the limited control of data that these companies have, we really don't see data market failures per se. I'm not sure really what's prescriptive here, other than that organizations shouldn't be at all concerned about hoarding information assets. Externalities I talked a bit about earlier. This is the cost or benefit caused by a producer that's not financially incurred or received by that producer. Externalities can be both positive or negative. Very often decisions based on data sources lead to externalities. This group of students shared the example seen here, in which a company using information decided to move its operations, thereby affecting tax revenues and traffic and housing costs and so forth. So I recommend that companies actually have a particular individual or group acting in a digital ethics capacity, such as the Archbishop suggested earlier, or red teams that establish that are set up for data initiatives to represent the bad guys and what possibly they might do with your data if they get access to it. And then finally, one group looked at the role of government, including several groups looked at the role of government and what its role should be in enabling data markets. they noted that because data isn't depletable, it may be difficult to incentivize and track its usage, and that regulations like the GDPR, via its like fine-based enforcement, for enforcement via fines, in effect places a monetary value on information, but one that doesn't actually correlate to the value of the data itself. So what they recommend was a more kind of a formal government regulatory body or bodies to ensure that both the positive and negative aspects of data's usage can be factored into regulation rather than be kind of piecemeal or secondary considerations such as it is currently. And I think until this happens, organizations are going to have to continue on their own to track or hire consultants to help them track, understand, anticipate, and react to the piecemeal data-related regulations, such as the dozens of industry, local, national, government regulations regarding data privacy.
Hey, Doug, we have like 3 minutes left.
Yeah, we're just wrapping up.
Okay.
So in short, data's has these unique economic characteristics that are unlike other assets, and because data is not yet a recognized balance sheet asset, most organizations fail to even consider or take full advantage of these differences. And then in terms of like kind of some key takeaways, I think business and data and technology leaders should really base their organization's data and analytics strategy on data's unique economic qualities. The way that your traditional goods and services and human capital operate when it comes to supply and demand, to things like pricing and valuation, they may not translate directly into the way that data behaves. And leaders who evolve their organization to capitalize on these kinds of nuances of data are really the ones who are winning and will continue to win in the information economy and the digital age. So that's what I have for you today. I'm going to pop back over to the Whova app for a few minutes and see if there are any questions.
Hey, Doug, yeah, you
go ahead and
questions.
Lay them on me.
Yeah, let me, we only have 1 minute. So I think let's tackle the question that had the most votes.
All right.
Could you talk a bit about some data monetizations projects ROI?
So yeah, there are a number of examples that I published in the Infonomics book. One example came from AIG, where they mapped the business value of data to its improvements in data quality metrics, and they were able to now determine how a 1% increase in data accuracy, or say a 3% increase in data completeness, improves the KPIs for the business processes where that data is used. Or another one that looked at how they assessed, using some of the Infonomics models, what the business relevancy of data was versus the actual economic benefits that certain data assets were delivering. And where they found a large gap, like high relevancy, low economic value, they said, we need to figure out better ways to leverage that data. And they identified 24 ways to better leverage the data, thereby generating an additional $300 million of market value on a $2 billion business. Or a
hey, Doug.
Yeah, sure.
Another question just jumped ahead of that one. So we're kind of at time, but
sure, I'll answer the rest in the chat.
But this one's kind of interesting. How are you putting data in your chart of accounts?
Yeah, you're not. Well, you can do it internally, but from an auditable perspective, international and U.S. accounting regulations don't allow you to capitalize on the value of your data assets. Only in very rare circumstances, like if you're a data broker, like Equifax or Experian or someone, and you purchase a database from someone else, you can capitalize that as under other intangibles and kind of straight line depreciate it. But even all the data that Facebook and Google and the rest of the digerati have, nowhere to be found on the balance sheet.
All right.
Yep.
Good. Well, I think that wraps up our session. Thanks everyone for attending. And you got a 15-minute break.
Thanks everyone.
14 minutes until the next one.
All right. Cheers.